When something tries to kill me, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that never happens again. We're just not there as a society. Like, we don't understand how impactful this can be on our health. And it's so common. I knew something was wrong and everybody else thought I was nuts. And then we found it. And I was like,
how did you first become aware about mold and then start to move into becoming the expert in it?
yeah. So as with so many people in this field, I experienced it myself. And very, very long story short, over the course of many years, my health was deteriorating in lots of, pretty weird ways. And, I saw doctor after doctor after doctor after doctor. And, everything was kind of just written off as one thing or another that was not treatable, or I was slapped with diagnoses that, had no treatment, had no cause. And really, it was just like, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, chronic this, chronic that. And we don't know why, and we don't know what to do about it. And then it really all came to a head when actually at two different points in time, where now in hindsight, I know I was living in moldy homes. I did not know at the time. But it all finally culminated with a medical practitioner who was actually an MD who was studying functional medicine. And I kept going to see her with all these different symptoms. And she finally said to me after about a year and a half of all these random symptoms building. And she said, "Have you ever lived in a moldy building? Have you ever lived in a moldy house?" And I said, "Well, yeah." A couple of years ago, I was living in an apartment that was definitely very moldy. We could smell it. We could see it. There were several active water leaks, et cetera. And then we'd moved a few years later to this very house, which is when I really started to crash and burn. And that was when that finally came to a head. And she set me down this path of, could it be mold? I got with a mold literate medical practitioner. We started doing some testing and realized, yes, sure seems that it is. Then we went and figured out that it was the house. We found it. We remediated successfully. And after a very long healing journey, I became very, very passionate about the topic. It's just one of those things, like, I'm one of those people when something tries to kill me, like, I'm gonna do everything in my power to make sure that never happens again. I'm also going to conquer it in every possible way. So that put me on this path to learning and educating myself. And then that just quickly spun into training, professional training, and then realizing I really want to help other people not have to go through what I went through. And I feel like a very, sort of primal need to change, make change out there and educate people and help people navigate this. And so, yeah, from there, I opened my consulting business where I help people navigate the whole process. And then earlier this year, I opened my own residential mold inspection business here in Colorado, where I go out and do mold inspection firsthand.
I can totally see how it can snowball like that. Like even for me, I was somewhat similar story, like years and years of health issues, saw upwards of 20 doctors and, eventually leading medical institutions, like top of the line experts, and so many times came back, empty handed, or we don't know, or we try this one, small intervention that might help with 5% of your symptoms. And then eventually, as I found great practitioners and pieced it together, it's like, yeah, I remember along the way, my thought was, this shouldn't be so hard to figure out. Like, this information is out there, but it shouldn't take the amount of digging and trial and error it took me. And I also, became passionate about it. And mold was a part of my story. I never knew I was living in a moldy place, but just when I went to the practitioner who really helped me, based on test results and all the clients he's helped, he's like, mold's definitely a part of your picture. Like, don't know, if you're in it now, we'll figure that out. But just you've got it in your body and it came from somewhere. So I learned a little bit about it. But the further I go, same thing with EMFs. It's like you kind of do need building knowledge and a little technical knowledge. So I get to the point where, like, man, I'm helping. My clients are chronic illness patients too. When people get sick at first, they go to a doctor. The first 5 times, they probably go to the doctor. After 5, 10, somewhere along the line, some people want to try something different, and that's when they'll come to me. So a lot of my clients, we do find that mold's part of the picture. And so as I've gone through that with them and they need further guidance or come back with questions, I kind of step down this rabbit hole. And like I said, at some point I felt like I needed certification, but there's like 20 things I'd love to be certified in. So I do my best and point in the best direction I can. And then also that's part of the point of this podcast, to bring on experts like you and different people who really know these topics, who can talk about it, so everyone could be much more aware and educated. So when you went through that, or if you have, people who, again, I until you go through it and are exposed to this idea, people have a really hard time wrapping their head around mold. I mean, you said it's trying to kill me. And I heard a lot of people say that, or the idea that mold can really be a serious health issue, suppress the immune system, and lead to a lot of downstream effects. So what was it that kind of flipped that switch in your head that helped you realize, like, okay, yeah, this is a major issue. This is potentially a big part of my health puzzle, and that motivated you to then learn more about it and dig into it?
Yeah. I mean, for me, by the time that idea was brought forward to me by this medical practitioner, this medical doctor, like, could it be mold? I was so desperate for answers. I mean, I was, in my early 40s, and I literally got to the point where I wrote my will because I was like, I'm pretty sure I'm on my way out here, like my list of symptoms. And they were like multiple debilitating symptoms, and, upwards of 40 that I could just rattle off at any point in time. Like, here are all the things I'm experiencing, like second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, day after day. It's like unrelenting symptoms that are, like I said, really debilitating. And so for me, I knew something was wrong. Like, I knew it was just not just this random smattering of diagnoses that meant nothing, that we could do nothing about. Like, I knew there was something. It felt very outside in to me. Like, it didn't feel like my body was manifesting these symptoms. It felt like something was making me sick. And so when she brought that up as an idea, I was like, this has got to be it. And then I think from that moment, the end of that phone call, I started really diving deep and looking into mold and understanding, what does it look like? What does it feel like? How does this present? And, the learning just has never stopped. It's just, this is something, it's pretty weird. It's like a very weird lifestyle I've created for myself here, where I'm like, I pretty much am thinking about, learning about, talking about, or looking at mold, every single day for years on end here. But, I lost my career to this. I used to do human resources. I had a very successful career for many years and was so ill, I was unable to work for several years. So yeah, I don't know. That was the tipping point for me. And from there, once it became clear, like, ooh, this seems to be the thing, we went to inspection, and we actually had a couple of rounds of inspection that didn't really find it, which is common. It's part of why I went into inspection, because I couldn't handle not getting into it, because it's so hard to find a good indoor environmental professional or IEP. Because, as you've said, mold is so far off the radar for society in general. Even people who work in the industry are just like sort of superficially working on the surface, because they just haven't, because there's not a lot of resources out there to learn and understand at a very deep level how this stuff works. How houses work and how water damage works and how it all comes together and how it affects people's health. So it's a very, very niche, area, and there's not that many of us really in it. So, we went through many rounds of inspection, and I kept saying, keep looking, keep looking, keep looking. It's here, it's here, it's here. And then they did finally find it. And it was like, I wanted to scream it from the rooftops, because I was like, everybody, as you've kind of insinuated, everybody thought I was nuts. Like, my family, my friends, my doctors, everybody was like, yeah, okay. It's extremely isolating, because I knew something was wrong. I knew, and everybody else thought I was nuts. And then we found it. And I was like, I knew it. So like very much a story of redemption for people when they get to that point. But then you get hit with this like, okay, now what do I actually do about it? And how do I fix this? And there's a whole nother, world that you involuntarily become a part of when you realize now I got to figure out how to deal with this.
Yes, that has totally been my experience. It's like, okay, you're right. It is challenging to find a really mold literate inspector who's thorough and understands it from the health impact, right? Like a lot of people can get a basic quick inspection that'll be like just check the box. All right, this real estate transaction can go through, but is someone going to really understand, hey, this is affecting the health of one or more people in the building, and how do we come at it from that perspective? It's been a challenge for me personally, challenge with our clients. We work through a lot of them. We try different ones, and there's a huge variation in what you'll get back. So that's another reason I really want to do this episode with you is to give people a bigger picture of here's what to look for and expect, so they can be somewhat knowledgeable and good consumers and get the help that they're going to need. So let's start right off the beginning. If somebody, say, either whether mold is part of their picture, they know it, they believe it, really feel it like you did, or whether they're not sure, but they have these frustrating, ongoing, mysterious symptoms, and mold is going to be one of the things you look at that point. Where would someone start, and in terms of an inspection or testing? And as a personal aside, I'm going through this myself right now, just moved into a new place and have to make that decision. So saw a few concerning signs, but then have to make the decision, okay, do I come get a full inspection? Will that person actually know what to look for, or should I start with my own test and then go from there? In general, where's a good place for people to think about starting?
Yeah, so that's a great question because it really depends. And to your point, there's so many variables that are unfortunately really outside of the consumer's control, right? Like, do you have access to someone who really knows what they're doing when it comes to inspection? And like, if you do, then that's probably a great place to start. But then you're stuck kind of as the consumer again, like you're holding the bag in terms of like, well, how do I figure out if this person knows what they're talking about? Because there are plenty of inspectors out there, mold inspectors, who think they know what they're doing and think they know what they're talking about. And there's different degrees of that, like that just is what it is. And that's with any trade and with any job, and because this industry is not regulated per se, it's, it's really challenging for a lay person to evaluate an inspector, for example, because, sure, there are all these certifications out there, but I can tell you I have most of them. And I can tell you I haven't learned that much from a lot of those programs. I've learned it by experience, by going through it myself, by helping other people through it, by talking with other colleagues. It's like I've taken a very, very multi-pronged approach. Because I knew simply taking a couple day training and getting a certification that I can put after my name doesn't actually mean that I know what I'm doing. So it's a really tough place for a consumer to be, especially nowadays. We have educated consumers. I have a lot of clients that I work with who are extremely educated, more educated on this stuff than most inspectors that I come across out there in the field across the country. So, there's that challenge of like evaluating and vetting an inspector. There are a couple of resources out there. ICI is one. ISEAI is an organization. They're pretty picky about their standards, and they have, a list of inspectors, IEPs, that meet the criteria that they've established to feel like these people know what they're doing. I'm trying to think of there's other training organizations, but again, it's like you can take a training and still not know really what you're doing. So part of it is the consumer needs to educate themselves.
Yeah. Are there a couple like questions that are would help okay, this is the mold inspector's approach. Like I learned this for biological dentistry too, because it became very profitable for dentists to put on their websites like biological dentist, holistic dentist, and some of them didn't know any of the principles. So if you do research, there's some good lists and maybe like 5 questions. Like, okay, if they do these 5 things, then they're likely, with the program. And if they don't know what you're talking about, or they say, no, we don't do that for XYZ, then okay, it might just be superficial tag. Someone's, reached out to um, mold inspectors. Are there a couple things you could ask like that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you'd want to be asking first off, like, are you familiar with hypersensitivity to mold or SIRS or hypersensitive occupants, however you want to phrase it, people who are sick from mold? What is your experience with that? Usually, even that question sometimes, because I do through my consulting business, I do a lot of vetting of inspectors because I have clients all over the country. You call me and say, hey, this is what's going on, right? And then we decide they need an inspection. Well, now we got to find somebody that's local to them. So I have these conversations pretty often. And starting off with that, sometimes you'll just straight up get the answer like, oh, mold is an allergen. It can't really make you that sick. Okay, that's not your person. Or they might say, yes, that is something that's a population that I serve. I'm very familiar. I have many clients I've dealt with. Yeah, I'm aware that that's a thing. And I believe that it's a thing. Okay. Then you want to move to the next question. You definitely want to get into like, what is your process? So people ask me all the time, what does your inspection process look like? And I love when they ask me this. 'Cause I'm like, let me tell you all about it. And how long does it take? So if somebody's coming in and saying, well, you're asking these questions and they're saying, I come in, I do air testing, I look around, generally takes, 45 minutes, an hour. This is not your person if you're a hypersensitive occupant, because they're relying on testing more so than inspection. And also air testing, while it's a valuable tool and I do use it in my inspection practice, I use it very strategically. And you'll never see me walking in and setting up an air test in the middle of your kitchen just to see if there's mold in your house, or, on a second story landing to see if there's mold in your house. That's not going to tell us if there's mold in your house. It's not. We know that. The people who created air testing know that it doesn't work that way. Where air testing can be valuable is like, okay, I think there might be a leak under this window, or even that's not a great idea and not a great example because there's usually insulation and exterior walls and we can't do great air sampling inside a wall cavity. But, the bathroom leaked into the ceiling. In the bathroom above me leaked into the ceiling. There's a water stain. How do we know if it's a problem or not? We might be able to do what we call cavity air sampling, where we drill a hole in the ceiling, taking an air sample from that ceiling cavity. That can be useful. But if somebody's coming and saying, I'm going to do air sampling and I'm going to look around, like, I'd be questioning that. My inspections typically, I tell people, are 3 to 6 hours. We start with the exterior. We do a full survey kind of and assessment of the exterior. We're looking for all sorts of things that can contribute to water intrusion or pooling, any ways for water to get into the building. And then we spend a ton of time inside. The other thing you can ask is, do you go in the attic? And when I say, do you go in the attic, I mean, do you pop your head in the attic and look around from the hatch? Or do you get up there and do what I refer to as an invasive attic inspection? We get up there, we crawl around. We might dig around in your insulation. And yes, we're going to mess up your insulation. We're going to lower the R value of your insulation. But if the priority is to find signs of water damage or mold, we have to do that because that's where it is in some cases. So, you want to be asking these questions around, like, to understand exactly what the scope of their inspection entails and whether they're leaning very heavily on testing or leaning very heavily on inspection. I'm in the camp that inspection should be the primary thing that we're doing. And then we're using sampling or testing strategically to validate our findings during inspection. And a lot of mold inspectors out there are doing the opposite. They're using testing and then saying, oh, maybe I should look around, and we know that doesn't work. It's not effective.
Okay. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. Based on findings, then, is there a test that you use most commonly, or is it, again, totally dependent all across the board?
If you have an inspector, they should be figuring that out. Like when people ask me, what testing do you do? I'm like, I don't know until I'm there inspecting your house. And my position on that is like, it should be very adaptable. Like I should not have a testing routine that I do in everybody's house. Um, some inspectors do, and I'm not saying they shouldn't. I'm just saying my approach is like, it's different. Every house I go to is a different situation. And it's part of my job as an inspector to figure out what makes the most sense for that particular house. Like, I think it's important to spend people's money wisely, because if they're at the very beginning of this process, I know from experience and from managing hundreds of people's, projects, that there's probably a lot more to come if we find stuff. So I don't want them to blow all their funds on inspection. I want them to save it for remediation, because that's where it really counts. So that's my position on testing. As far as like ERMI or testing that you can do if you don't have a good inspector, or if you want to do some preemptive testing before you decide, do I need to hire an inspector? ERMI is one tool that has become very popular in the mold community. We like it because it is PCR technology, so it's DNA level analysis. And so it's inherently more accurate because of that, because it's high technology analysis that's being done versus like air testing, for example, that it's a person looking under a microscope. And you're just, there's certain methodologies that they utilize to do that. There's estimations and extrapolations happening. There's their training. There's whether they had their second cup of coffee this morning, yada, yada, right? And then there's the limitation of the test itself and how we use it and how we collect. But ERMI also has its limitations. There are those, so there's sampling and like, did they do it right? Did the person do it right? Did they collect from the right areas? Did they get enough dust? Was their dust aged enough to give us a reflection of what the health of the home is? There's all these things. And then, it goes to a lab and there's analysis and interpretation happening there and extrapolation. And then there's actual interpretation of the report itself. So ERMI is not perfect. However, it can be used. And I do like to encourage people to use it when they're at the point of deciding, like, I'm sick. Is it my home? Is it mold? Or is it something else? When they're at this point of like, let me rule it in or rule it out. I think ERMI is really helpful for that. And because what it's doing is, so for people who aren't familiar with it, you basically take a Swiffer, clean, dry Swiffer cloth. You can get it from the lab if you order a kit from certain labs that offer the ERMI, ERMI. You take it and you go, and they give you instructions, basic instructions. You go around and you collect dust from around your living space. So one of the errors I see people make sometimes is they send off their ERMI. It generally costs around $240. So they spend the $240, they send it off, they get their report, and then they call me and say, can you interpret this? And I say, where did you collect from? And they say, my window tracks, my crawl space, which is super common. And I'm like, oh, no, I don't really want to know. I don't want to use this tool to evaluate your crawl space. I want to use this tool to evaluate your living space, because that's what it's kind of meant to do. So the ultimate purpose of it is that we know that mold is an airborne contaminant because it's microscopic, whether it's wet and sporulating, which means it's literally attempting to reproduce by shooting spores out into the air. So therefore it becomes airborne. Or if it's old and dry, it's now brittle and powdery and easily airborne, just with even regular, microcurrents that exist within our homes. Either way, if it's there, it's most likely airborne. And any sort of contaminant that's airborne, most of it eventually settles onto our surfaces, our horizontal surfaces primarily, and becomes part of what we know as dust, what we see as dust. What's in dust, I've seen reports where we send dust samples off to a lab, they look at it under a microscope and they tell us what's in it. What's in it is dirt leaves, insect fragments, fur from our pets, hair, skin, our own skin cells, quite a bit of it, fibers from our clothes, fibers from our furniture, and mold spores. All of these things are in dust, mold fragments. So when we collect dust for the ERMI, we send it off to a lab, they do this DNA analysis, and then they tell us how much mold was in there. And they're looking at 36 particular species that we know to be either common indoors because they're common outdoors, and what's outdoors comes indoors, or water damage indicators. There are certain species of mold that we know are very common indoors in water damage situations because they flourish on materials that we use to build our houses, like drywall and OSB, plywood, all of these things. So we're looking specifically for those molds, and then we get this report and we can kind of get a gauge on what is the overall mold load in the home. Are there specific species that we know to be severe water damage indicators that are looking particularly high? If so, we might then say, okay, we might have a mold issue here. It's worthwhile to move forward with an inspection. Or we might say, you know what, this looks pretty average. Like there's nothing crazy jumping out. Every home has mold. We never get an ERMI back that's all not detected. There's always mold because it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's part of our normal ecology. We expect there to be mold in the home. We just don't expect there to be high levels of severe water damage indicators that we know to be affect people's health.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that's great. I feel a little better. I'm on the
Sorry,
right.
that was a very long explanation.
But it for people who listen to this, I really hope they come across it early in their journey. And if they do have a mold question, like everyone has those questions, and you figure it out through 20 Google searches and going into these old chat rooms or the Facebook groups. But those are kind of a difficult place because some of the symptoms of mold are just high anxiety and overwhelm. And there's a lot of that energy in there. So if you go too far down that hole, you'll come out totally worried about every single thing you see. So it is, and this is what I found for myself with mold. It's a bit of a technical subject, and yeah, no one wants to do it, but we all want to be healthy too. No one wants their health crash. No one wants to spend 5-10 years of their life in chronic fatigue. So the stakes are pretty high. And when it's a player in the health picture, or potentially, it's really valuable information to know. And you're touching on some of the things that I came across. It's like, okay, I got the ERMI, but how do I even take the sample in the right way so it's actually useful? Because so many people run it, like you said, then they go to an expert and they're like, well, you did this and this, so now we can't, it's not really going to tell us the picture. And the person's like, come on, I just want to know, is this thing really affecting my health or not? So it's just kind of the nature of the beast. And I think it is very helpful if it's something that someone has to consider. So let's go to this other example where I can see where a water event clearly happened. However, upon my unprofessional inspection, and also just from case history, I feel significantly better in the new home than the old home, which kind of makes me wonder about what exactly was going on in the old home and what got missed through 2 rounds of testing and inspection. But anyway, so from a case basis, it's like the evidence is it's at least an improvement. But obviously visually, it's like something happened. And again, based on what I've seen with clients and people go through, it's like, well, if there was an issue, it wasn't remediated, then odds are it just didn't go away on its own. So if you can see some kind of water event, then isn't an ERMI a broad spectrum? Just say, hey, is there like I love the use case you described. Like, hey, let's get an idea. Could this be an issue or not? Is that still appropriate, or do we need to move forward and be like, hey, get an inspector in and let's really dig into this?
There's 2 different ways to look at it. I mean, you could say, let me do an ERMI and just see if there's evidence that this could be in my living space, that there could be, like I was saying, water damage indicator molds in high amounts in my living space. I do think the body is such an important piece of the puzzle, like, because that's why we're doing all this, right? Like, it's the whole point is because someone's not feeling well, in the home, and we're wondering if it's mold that's creating that. So, that's a very important piece of the puzzle. And that's the starting point to me, where it's like, okay, if you're feeling better here, yes, sure, there's this like, well, how bad was the old place? If I'm feeling better here and I'm looking at water damage. And then there's the matter of, okay, do I want to go down this rabbit hole, or am I feeling really good and I don't think I need to do that? Because there's also, it's very, as you alluded to earlier, like there's a very significant emotional component to this. Very, very significant. And some of it is like physiological, right? And that's another rabbit hole we could go down with all this, limbic effect and retraining and all that kind of stuff, because it is very, very triggering for people. Because like I said, at one point I was like, I'm clearly dying, like obviously that's very impactful to me. And there's a lot of trauma and stress that comes along with going through this whole journey. But anyway, coming back to your actual question, I think it's a very personal decision that you need to make, right? Like in your case, it's like, well, do I want to open this whole thing up, or am I feeling good? And can I just be like, cool, I'm going to assume it's okay because I feel okay? If the answer is no, like either I'm not comfortable, or maybe I still have a few lingering symptoms and I'm really wondering, or I just need to know because I'm that type of person. Could you do an ERMI? Yes. As I said, you could do it and get a gauge for like, do I think this is impacting my living space? But then you're up against like interpreting it, right? And it's not, I think I might be on my own on this when I say like, it is not meant to be a diagnostic tool. It is not. And I see a lot of folks out there who are using it diagnostically. And I don't, because I know there's too much room for error in there. And every house is unique. Every situation is unique. Every person's body is unique. Like, it's a tool. I use it. It's a data point. That's it. So I never say to the, if people come to me all the time, like, can you look at this ERMI and tell me if I should buy this house or not? And I'm like, absolutely not. I will not tell you to make a life decision based on an ERMI. There's just too much room for error in there. But the other option is, you jump right to an inspection and you find somebody who can do more invasive inspection. Like in your case, I'd want to get in there and, drill a 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch hole in your ceiling and get in there with a borescope and look around. There's a tiny little camera I have that's like the size of a pen that I can get into a hole and look around and see. And often I can see water damage and I can see mold and I can say, hey, yeah, we need to remediate this. And we have a definitive answer, or I can get up there and do that. Plus maybe do an air cavity sample or a cavity air sample, like I mentioned earlier, where I can stick a tube into that hole and pull an air sample from that cavity to give me data and show me, like, is there an excessive amount of mold or molds that we wouldn't normally expect to see in a ceiling cavity that are consistent with water damage, that are going to make me say, you know what, I do think there's water damage in there. I do think there's mold. I think we should move forward with remediation. So it's just a matter of, like, again, it comes back to resources. And I think where you are just in life, financially, emotionally, do I need to know this? Am I okay not knowing this? Am I okay with like a data point? And is that sufficient for me to like move on and be okay? To me, it's a very personal decision, but there are options.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I mean, you're confirming a lot. Like, each client I have, they go through this exactly too. Like, we would all love a playbook and an exact answer, but it totally varies both on their health level and the condition of the home or building. So,
and also, like, some people, if you're in a rental or do you own it? Is there, do we know what happened? Do we not know what happened? I've also seen, for what it's worth, every once in a while, I see a water event that occurred. We see evidence of it. We check it out and there's nothing there. Like, things, I will say, and people need to hear this. I've needed to hear this many times and I still need to hear it from time to time. Like, it can be okay. Like, yes, mold is very common and it happens very often when we have water damaged building materials. It is possible that things can dry out fast enough that we don't have mold. It's possible. I wouldn't say it's the norm, but it can happen. I've also seen where people have a water event and they handle it properly, and then it doesn't progress to mold. It can happen. It's by far the minority. Absolutely. It really is. Otherwise, I wouldn't have two companies that are very busy. It, yeah.
Of course, I'm hoping that's the case for me, but I also know and have been through this enough. There's this interesting, it's just like a resistance we have to really digging in and looking at it. I don't know if it's the dirty closet thing where like, I don't know if I want to know what's in there. And it is, there's definitely a cost to it, but there's a huge cost to having your health tank and spending 10 years sick. So that's also we have to remember. But even though, I know that, or walk through this with clients who are in that position. Like I've been miserable for 5 years. It's like, okay, well, do we want to do a $500 inspection? And there's still a lot of resistance. So it's,
yes.
Yeah, I think it's because the idea is still, like we talked about at the beginning, there's still just not common knowledge. It's even though intellectually people understand it kind of at a deeper level, we're not really like, yeah, okay, I really need to do a thorough look at the mold if I have these ongoing health issues. So I know I'm just as susceptible to that as anybody else. So that's why I try and catch myself. So, okay. So maybe on that note, can we cover a little bit about ways that water can get in the home? You mentioned that earlier. And this was just a learning for me. It's kind of shocking. So there's, we can't cover all of them by any stretch because it is really surprising all the different ways and these different examples I've seen with other people or learned about. But I don't know if you could hit on the big ones, and especially big ones that people may not think about and unfortunately find out about like years down the road when it's gone on for so long that it destroys someone's health.
Yes, I love this question. So the first thing I would say is like, man, people underestimate the damage that water can do often. And I will also say it's very easily written off. Like as a society, and I love what you brought up just a minute ago. Like there is this huge tendency for people to just sort of brush it off. Denial is really, really big. But it's also, yeah. So when I think about, because I'll ask somebody this every day, I think I have some version of this conversation. Tell me about the history of the house. What's happened? Have there been any water events? No. Then I say, okay, what about, have you ever had a dishwasher leak, a toilet overflow, bathtub, consistent splashing out of the bathtub, or a water heater burst, or a basement flood, water come in through an egress window? And I start listing things off, and then they start saying, oh, a washing machine overflow. Oh, I did a roof leak. Oh, wait, we did have a roof leak, and we actually did get basement water in the basement this one time because my sump pump failed, but it was only like 2 inches, and we shop vacked it out of there. Everything was dry. We dried it with some towels. Oh, and yes, and I did have my toilet back up once. And then I'm like, okay, you've had 3 significant water events. It's just, it doesn't register. And I think part of it is because we're just not there as a society. Like we don't understand how impactful this can be on our health. And it's so common. That's the other thing is these things are so common that we expect them to happen. We consider them normal, and we therefore write them off. And we miss this huge opportunity primarily to deal with it properly. So like immediately, so that it doesn't become an issue down the line. I also often get like, well, there's this, water stain on the ceiling, but it's been there for years and it's never changed. Like, okay, but that means at some point there was a leak into the ceiling. Like when I say to people sometimes like, okay, so if there's a water stain on your kitchen ceiling and there's a bathroom above it, like some point your bathroom leaked into your kitchen ceiling, and it's just people don't make the connection until I spell it out. And then they're like, oh, okay, yeah, like water stains on a ceiling don't come from nowhere. They come from water. And especially when you're thinking about a bathroom, like, was it the toilet? Because that's what we call category 3 water, depending on where it exactly came from. That's not something you want in your living space. Category 3 is black water. It's like definitively grossly contaminated water, and it's just like this stuff doesn't register with people. So it's a big problem. So I did rattle off in there, I think, to answer your question, some of the common things that I see, right? Some pump failures, water in the basement because of a heavy rain. Let me take a moment and just say, if you have a basement with egress windows, below grade windows, please, for the love of God, please put covers on them. Not the metal grates that do nothing, but you can get plastic covers that actually keep rain from getting in there, because I've seen so many cases that could have been really easily prevented with that, where, you get a heavy rain and it fills up your window well, like a swimming pool. And that is too much for a window to handle. It's also too much for porous concrete foundation to handle. And I've seen so many basements flooded because of that, when it could have totally easily been prevented by putting actual covers on your window wells.
Yeah, you had a great Instagram post about that with the visual, because I didn't even know that existed. But well, that makes a lot of sense. We have the gutters draining the water away from the foundation, and yeah, it makes sense that that's kind of a weak point or an entry point in the structure, and want to seal it off somehow. All right. So say one of these things happens, if someone has a water event. I mean, I really like how you mentioned earlier, like you've seen people handle it, deal with it, get it cleaned up, and it's okay. Like it can be managed. It's not disaster. But say it's an event. Is there hope for remediation if they have that example that something leaked into the ceiling and it was never fixed before, so at some point it probably does need to be fixed? And what are some of the biggest things that are important for people to be aware of, that you help your clients be aware of when they go through remediation?
Woof. So I'll try to make this brief. Just feel free to interrupt me if I'm
Let's open up a whole new episode for us.
Yeah. So I am extremely passionate about remediation, mold remediation. It's something I've taken virtually every training and certification that's out there for remediation, because as an inspector, as a mold consultant, and then also as a mold inspector, I need to understand remediation. This is one of my biggest pet peeves with mold inspectors who don't understand remediation. Like, half of our job is, once we find the problem, is putting together what we call a scope of work to tell people how to actually remediate it. Like, that's in scope for an inspector to determine how to fix the problem. And remediation is the answer, is how we fix the problem. So yeah, I mean, remediation can be successful. I'm sitting in this house that 3 years ago was killing me because we successfully remediated. We were super lucky, and we had a remediator who is CSRS literate, understands hypersensitive occupants and executes their remediation accordingly, because hypersensitive occupants require really a style of remediation that is above and beyond the standard. We have the standard, which most people are not even executing to that. And then we have hypersensitive occupants for whom we really have to go like a couple of extra steps to make sure that they're going to be able to heal in that environment post-remediation, post-successful remediation. So yeah, I mean, the first thing, so just to give a top line of what remediation is. So mold remediation it's fixing the problem, right? It's removing the mold and addressing that whole. So the steps of remediation, this might be easier to explain it this way, is basically, first is containment. So first we identify the area. Let's say like there's a water stain on the kitchen ceiling, there's a bathroom above it, and we're like, something must have happened at some point. I wonder if there's mold in there. Or we've gone through invasive inspection and determined there is mold in there. Let's deal with it. So first step would be containment. So a remediator would come in and contain the work area. Containment is literally containing the work area. They do that with plastic sheeting. It's called 6 mil plastic. That's the thickness of the plastic. There are a lot of things that can be done the right way and the wrong way. And there are standards in place. Like I said, there are some remediators who are following them, and there are many who are not. So these are also things you want to be thinking about when you're vetting remediators, is asking these types of questions. How thick is the plastic that you use? I've asked that question and I've been told 2 mil. And I know the standard is 6 mil. So I'm not going to use them because they're using plastic that's too thin and that cannot withstand negative pressure, which I'll talk about in a second, which is what we need to protect the rest of the living space from the work area. So containment is basically just building a work area with plastic sheeting, the proper thickness of plastic sheeting at 6 mil, and proper taping techniques, proper type of tape, and they contain the work area. I like to see for hypersensitive occupants what we call a decon chamber or decontamination chamber. It's basically a little mini containment that they build that's a transitional area. It just helps protect the rest of the living space, as it gives them a space to don and doff their PPE and put in clean things before they take them out of the containment and walk them through the house, for example. And then once they have containment built, they're typically, in most cases, putting the work area under negative pressure. And the whole concept of negative pressure is that it's physics. So positively pressured air moves towards negatively pressured air. Negative cannot move towards positive. So by putting the work area under negative pressure, we're basically making sure that all of the stuff, the work that they're doing in there, which they're going to be like revealing, moldy stuff, cannot get out because it's under negative pressure, and negative can't move to positive. So it can't contaminate the rest of the house. And the way we do that is by using what's called an AFD, or an air filtration device. Typically, we hook up some circular plastic to it and we vent it out a window. We seal up the window. And by doing that, it's basically a big fan. It's basically a big air purifier. And by venting air, sucking air from inside the containment and venting it out a window, we're putting that containment under negative pressure.
So for anyone who's hearing that and is like saying to themselves, my gosh, is all that going to be necessary? Because they will meet contractors and maybe even inspectors who tell them, no, it's not that big a deal. We'll just whatever. We'll tear out some drywall, slap some new drywall up, and you'll be good to go. Of course, you can do whatever you want, so you don't have to do anything. But especially in the case we're talking, someone's health is seriously struggling, and this has been identified as a piece of the picture. So that whole process with the negative air pressure and containment, it is not to contaminate the rest of the home. But can you cover a little bit, like, have you ever seen that go wrong, or this is another thing you see in the mold groups that's very disheartening, because there's people who believe they can never escape it. They've remediated 3 times and still having issues. So it's a pretty high bill usually if you have to do extensive work. So it's a very valuable thing to understand, so you get it right the first time and can feel safe, enjoy your home, and return to good health. So can you explain a little bit why that's important, or what you've seen if it's not done to that level of detail?
It's super important, especially for hypersensitive occupants. It's not uncommon that we see that hypersensitive occupants, because they've been if they're in the home that has sensitized them and made them sick, like they are often, not always, particularly hypersensitive to what's going on in that environment, those particular molds. And, we really need to take extra caution to make sure that we're getting rid of it effectively and that we're not cross-contaminating the rest of the house. As we talked about earlier on, it is an airborne contaminant. It's microscopic. That's why when we take an air sample, we send it off to a lab to look at it under a microscope, because they need to magnify it, many, 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 many times to be able to actually even see it, and then further to identify it. So we know it's microscopic, it's airborne, it's very easily airborne. So we have to take all these precautionary measures and multiple layers of engineering controls. Containment is one engineering control. Negative pressure is another engineering control. In case the containment fails, we at least have the area under negative pressure. It's a secondary engineering control. But that is basic. Like, every remediator should be doing that in a mold remediation job. There should be containment, there should be negative pressure, there should be removal of affected materials. So we don't spray, moldy drywall with a chemical or a fungicide. I don't care how fancy the word is that they use for the chemical. That is not how you do mold remediation. Mold remediation means, by definition, according to the proper standard, which is the IICRC S520, which is the written standard for how to execute mold remediation, you physically remove affected building materials. So if drywall has been made water damaged and moldy, you cut it out, plus, 18 to 24 inches minimum beyond the affected area, just like we do for skin cancer, because it's microscopic. We know we can't always see where the end of it is. So we go beyond what's visible to get a clean margin of error. So yes, I have seen cases where it has gone wrong because proper containment was not established, negative pressure was not established, and it's created some huge problems for people. And yes, I've seen stories. I've talked to people who feel like, they're never going to be able to get their house back to a place where they can live in it again. And it's devastating for somebody who's already dealing, to your point, with the medical, trauma and being as sick as they are. And especially as you talked about, like brain fog, confusion, high anxiety. These are all very common physiological effects and symptoms of mold toxicity. So when you're dealing with those things and then trying to manage a project that is critical to your health and your well-being and your family and your financial stability and all these things, there is a ton on the line. And it's just such a difficult journey for people to go through. And it's so hard to find really credible information out there to be able to learn all these things, to then vet the remediator to make sure they're going to do it the right way, because there's no regulations dictating that they do it the right way. It's a very, very tough place to be.
Yeah. So that's what I continuously find. So again, it's kind of why I want to do this episode and why we're getting a little detailed, but it's just like I find people run into these things step 2, maybe not step 1, but then step 2. And it's like, these are all the big questions. These are the money questions, because it's the difference of having a smooth process, rebounding like you have in your home, getting back to good health, enjoying the home, enjoying life again, versus having it just continuously linger and follow you around. So maybe we could close by talking about some of that. You mentioned the emotional piece, and we know there's the struggling, difficult part. And how about the positives? If they do good remediations, or their hope for the future. It sounds like you have a great success story. It's good for people to hear. And do you have any recommendations either about what worked for you or your clients in terms of managing the difficult emotions and moving more towards the positive outlook and rebuilding?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I would say from my experience personally, and, like I said, helping hundreds of people through this journey, it's different for everyone. And I've seen some really amazing turnarounds where people got out of the moldy environment, got to a safe place, and started healing immediately. And, immediately had this sense of hope and oh my God, this can get better. And I've watched them get better very, very quickly. And then, I have cases, and mine too was a very long journey to healing. It took a couple of years before I was finally okay, I think I'm getting better. And everybody's body is different. Everybody's immune system is different, has a different history and different capabilities. There's also, as you mentioned, the emotional component, which I think is really, really big. There's, as I've said, a lot of trauma involved with this, a lot. For somebody to be in a state like I was, where I'm pretty sure I'm dying. I have a family. I had a 4-year-old at the time. And it's incredibly isolating. As we've said, nobody really understands what you're dealing with. So there's that. Then you find, maybe community in some of these groups out in Facebook. But then, you're getting a constant barrage of other people's stories and other people's trauma and other people's anxiety. And that can be really overwhelming. but it's not uncommon for people to feel, and I definitely experienced this, where I was like obsessively researching, obsessively reading everything in all of the mold groups because I felt like I needed to learn. And it felt like the most accessible way to learn to me as a layperson. But by doing that, what I underestimated was how much of other people's stuff I was taking on. And then starting to wonder like, well, is what happened to them going to happen to me? It's just human nature that we do this. And it can be really hard to get out of that. I see it a lot where people, and then the anxiety level just gets to like debilitating level. And you're questioning everything. You don't trust anyone. You don't trust any information. Nothing's ever good enough. You're never going to get out of it. And there's a lot to be said for, I've talked with clients who've kind of made it to the other side. And several of them have said to me, like, I wish I had gotten out of the group sooner. I wish I had stopped like steeping myself in this stuff sooner because I kind of forgot that I could get through it. I forgot that there could be like a normal life on the other side of this. And so I think that's really important. And, there are limbic retraining systems out there. There's SCUPTA, DNRS, Primal Trust that are really built to do this, to address this piece of it, because we know it becomes a physiological condition. Like the emotional part of it affects us physiologically. Absolutely. There's like a very clear connection with, all this research they've done in limbic and brain, neurology. They realize like, oh, okay, your mind is telling your brain what to think and your brain is telling your body what to do. So it becomes really, really important to get a handle on that. And I think that's a big, big piece of recovery for a lot of people, or a piece that's being underestimated that a lot of people need and don't realize that that's what they need.
Exactly. I mean, that has to be, in my opinion, needs to be part of any, mold health picture. You rebuild the house, you got to build the emotional system and just that alertness in the brain, because you're right. You do have to learn a lot to, protect yourself and get the job done right. But you also it has to be balanced. So you're not always worried and looking around the corner for the next thing. So I think it's a great summary. If people want to follow more of your work, learn more from you, hire you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah. So my consulting business I operate nationally. It's called Mold Mentor LLC. My social media is all under that name. Really, I'm only on Facebook and Instagram because I'm aged out for for TikTok and all that other stuff. So I'm on those two. My website, moldmentorllc.com. I have a great resource that I want to share because I started talking about the steps of remediation. I didn't quite get through them all, and that's okay because I know I am very technical and very detailed. But if people want more information like that, or questions they can ask an IEP or an inspector when they're shopping and vetting those professionals, same with remediators. There is a nonprofit organization called Change the Air Foundation. Their website is changetheairfoundation.org. I was so impressed with their content that I joined the board earlier this year so that I could help contribute and build content and be a part of supporting this nonprofit that is right now completely focused on mold awareness and indoor air quality. And their level of, quality and credibility for the information they put out there is extremely high. And I'm very picky. And that's pretty much the only resource, like besides myself, that I feel, 100% comfortable saying, hey, this is a really valuable resource. Everything is free. And there's very detailed technical information out there that is accessible to consumers to answer a lot of these questions if they don't want to come and work with somebody like me. That's another great resource.
Great. Yeah, we'll link to that. We will link to all of your stuff. That's great to know about because that's really what people need is this high quality information to be well informed, to make the best decisions they can. That was the goal for our podcast today. And I feel great about what we covered. So thank you again for coming on and sharing all your expertise with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. I'm always happy to take advantage of opportunities to educate and raise the bar and the level of awareness out there around mold.